In Canada, generally at the beginning of meetings or at assemblies, we recognize the traditional territory of the Indigenous people through a land acknowledgement. The Indigenous people called this land home before the arrival of settlers, and many still call it home. Since I'm speaking to you from London, Ontario, Canada, I acknowledge that we are situated on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Leopakwu, and the Adirondack peoples, on lands connected with London Township and Sombre Treaties of 1796, and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant wampum. I respect the long-standing relationships that Indigenous nations have to this land, as they are the original caretakers. I acknowledge historical and ongoing injustices that Indigenous peoples endure in Canada and work to correct these injustices. Thank you, Tapalat and Miigwech, to Pauline Stephen, the Chief Executive Officer and Registrar of the General Teaching Council for Scotland, for the invitation to join you in presenting its annual lecture. Today, Robert Burns Day, is a very significant time for you. I wish you an opportunity to consider the importance of his work, which has influenced thinkers around the world, to reflect on his contributions to the culture of Scotland, and to celebrate him. Enjoy. In this think piece, Ethics and the Teaching Profession, Why What We Value, Think, and Do Really Matters, I'll connect and/or reconnect with some questions, comments, challenges, and reflections about how our ethics are intertwined with our teaching. I'll look at why we educate, the impact of various actors and agencies on education, teachers and teaching, honoring teachers' work and teachers' voices, ethical codes, self-research, and professional competence. I'll use the term teacher often. In this word, I include registered teachers in Scottish nursery, primary, and secondary schools, further education teachers and lecturers, teachers and lecturers delivering initial teacher education, college lecturers, headmasters, in short, any member on the register of teachers qualified to teach in Scotland. Teaching is a complex process. Looking at what we value, think, and do, and recognizing that this really matters is essential for effective teaching, but not always easy to do or understand at the outset. Often as teachers, we may think of a list of what is it that I have to do will direct and inform our teaching. Or if we use a particular strategy, we can affect the learning that we want for our students. If I worked on an assembly line, I do the work, follow the directions, use the what is it that I have to do list, and achieve results. There, that list or recipe may work. But I don't work at a manufacturing company. I teach students. Teaching is about building relationships, about knowing our students' needs, responding to those relationships and needs, a process that really matters. Kenyon Smith states that quality learning and teaching can never just be reached. It can't just be ticked off a checklist. It's not something completed in order to simply move on to the next goal. Quality learning and teaching evolves through new thinking and challenges. It happens over time as we grow and mature as teachers. I came into teaching many years ago, and over those years have grown into a teacher. I've taught at the primary, secondary, and tertiary levels of education, have administered as a vice principal, principal, and academic lead at those levels, and worked in government as a civil servant, in some instances, thriving in the work I did. First and foremost, my role was always as a teacher. My relationships with my students and colleagues while I worked with them is what I value most. I teach. In a recent conversation with a former teacher candidate I worked with over 20 years ago, we talked about our course. She commented that after the first 5 years of teaching in her classroom, she understood more fully some of the issues we discussed and their implications. It takes time to develop as a teacher. Discussions with former students often begin with, "Remember when?" but then quickly move to the relationships we have with our students and the teaching activities we do or did and how changes are taking place today. As a relational quest, teaching is far more nuanced and layered than a teacher's proficiency in presenting curricular requirements and instructional strategies. Teaching requires attention to its subtleties, those elements that are often indefinable, that are morally and ethically infused, but nevertheless perceived. The tone of voice a teacher uses to speak to a child, the way a teacher justly adjudicates among competing needs and interests in the classroom, in the way a teacher selects resources with care, evaluates student work with honesty, respect, and conducts his or her daily practice with honor, diligence, fairness, and compassion. Taken together then, ethics and teaching seem inherently compatible and unavoidably intertwined. We recognize that teaching is complex work, both relationally and intellectually. Developing teacher professionalism is about the way we are as professionals. It informs who we are, how we act, what we know and do, and what we prioritize. Teachers and teaching really matters, so how we learn, grow, and develop throughout our careers is important and needs to be prioritized. Why we educate, a multidimensional question, has been studied by researchers and arrived at with many reasons. To develop a vibrant democracy, to cultivate an educated citizenry, inherently valuable, correlates a nation's educated people and the country's economic success, becoming more than we are. And the list continues. It's a very long one. Others, such as Henry Giroux, provide a different view. In his case, the three key principles of education in a democracy deal with schools, teachers, and students. That public schools are one of our most important democratic public spheres. That teachers are a crucial public resource who should be treated with dignity and a measure of autonomy. And that students deserve an education that enables them to become fully responsible and critically engaged citizens, rather than one that views them as customers or low-skilled workers. More recently, Geert Biesta presented the idea that education is oriented towards three domains of purpose. The first, qualification function of education, has to do with the making available of knowledge and skills. The second, the socialization function of education, is present. The presentation and representation of cultures, traditions, and practices, either explicitly, but often implicitly, as research has shown on the hidden curriculum. The third function, Biesta labels as subjectification, which could be called individuation. Education always has an impact on the student as individual, either by enhancing or by restricting capacities and capabilities, for example. It is about how we exist, how we lead our lives, which no one else can do for us. Biesta believes that it is of crucial importance that teachers and the educational profession more widely have a clear sense of what their education is actually about. He continues, the ongoing challenge is to maintain an educationally meaningful balance between these domains of qualification, socialization, and subjectification. This challenge lies at the heart of teacher professionalism. Many researchers have determined that the teacher is an educational professional who should have scope for judgment and discretion, but this is too often forgotten. This forgotten element has a profound impact on educational practice, and more especially on the position of the teacher, as we see next. Over time, and now currently, nation states and educational institutions are firmly embedded in a global arena that emphasizes the importance of education in the knowledge society and in the competition between regions in a global market. This defined importance of education is a far cry from the time mass education became mandatory and speaks to how much education has developed, but that's come at a cost. Outside agencies like the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development and the European Union have their interests in education represented when they develop policies, programs, and reports advising and influencing governments on the curricula. These agencies infuse their beliefs and ideas into the reports they prepare, which in turn affect decision makers. Recently, an OECD report, Scotland's Curriculum for Excellence into the Future, stated, in part, concerning Scottish teachers, that teachers are well-trained and respected professionals in Scotland, and school leaders have developed strong pedagogical leadership capacities. Both are committed to varied teaching approaches for student learning and have proven their ability to develop schools' own curricula. Curriculum design and continuous improvement require time and professional investment, which schools can only achieve with ongoing support from the system. Within its recommendations, OECD is very clear about the importance of quality teaching for quality learning, and the reduction of opportunities that exist for teacher agency, brought about by the complex context for educational reform, makes this difficult. The OECD report echoes Graham Donaldson, who in his 2021 annual lecture for GTC Scotland spoke about the need to help teachers to continue to develop professionalism, how to find room to breathe, to reflect, to collaborate, to think, to research. How do we create the deep cultural change that is necessary to encourage teacher agency, teacher empowerment, teacher improvement, so that teachers can provide leadership, all very necessary for teachers to thrive as professionals and respond to student needs? Being involved in education as a teacher is more than definitions. What is education? Or ideas from theory, as important as these are? Or political ideologies, or reports, or accolades? We're here because for us as teachers, we teach. Teaching is like no other profession. Even though it's steeped in contradictions and is at the forefront of every political party, we stay. Many questions come. Why do we do what we do? Why do we teach? What is it that we value, think, and does that really matter? What kind of teachers did we want to be? What type of teacher are we now? The answers to these questions require a critical approach to and scrutiny of our practice. At times, we see ourselves as a deficit model, what we've not done ably or skillfully, what those who assess our work tell us what's wrong and suggest and ask what we need to do to improve. That deficit model, that deficit narrative, and too often what's presented to us and how we're represented is inaccurate. This model, this narrative, must change. Reframing the narrative through our teacher voices allows us to highlight the joys and hopes characteristic in teaching, with a more comprehensive and nuanced discussion of teaching that goes well beyond the current narratives. The asset model, the strengths-oriented perspective, helps present counter-narratives that directly refute the deficit model and often provide an evidence-based explanation. Research reveals that being attentive to and building on strengths leads to success. What we are able to do skillfully, looking at our strengths, aspirations, and contributions to our students and to our teaching community is what is the basis of the strengths model. By honoring our work and the work of other teachers, we recognize the competencies and capabilities of and in ourselves, our colleagues, and our teaching community. In looking at these strengths, I also uncover issues about my professionalism and may rediscover why I went into this profession. This is the strength-oriented narrative I want to share. In my most recent role, I worked with and challenged teacher candidates, those who next week, next month, next year will be working in schools with their students. I want to help them develop their voices, their identity. Research conducted by Buchanan and Hargraves noted that the teacher's lack of power has affected both their sense of self and any real attempt to construct a strong teacher identity. Related to this, Bellini questioned, if teachers do not have a voice and do not own their professional identity, how do they develop a sense of ethics? By not being able to form their own identity, their own self, and take care of that self, educators are left with little choice but to accept a professional identity manufactured for them, and that's not acceptable. Bellini suggests that reflection, that self-research may be one answer to increase an educator's sense of self-awareness and identity. The end result should be to foster and nurture strong professionals in the field, but this cannot be done by putting the other first. Perhaps one of the biggest casualties of the education system is the lack of self-care, self-development, and enlightenment educators have been afforded. The impact of having our profession steeped in stakeholders' agendas, politicians' platforms, and social media's judgment is that it has obliterated any sense of the self in educators. This silencing has come with a cost as educators have retreated into their profession, relinquishing their role to that of a de-skilled worker. In a different context, Bista asks whether the messages we convey are those we deem desirable for the education of our students. Our students lose when we convey or allow others to convey negative narratives. Change is needed. In 2019, Maureen McKenna, president of the Association of Directors of Education Scotland, presented a challenge that the ownership of change with a continued focus on the improvement of outcomes for all Scottish children and young people be taken. Teachers are the ones who can lead that difficult but rewarding change. Our impact in school systems and on students is immense. On the release of the report of Ontario's Royal Commission on Learning, Jerry Kaplan, a commissioner involved, said, "Teachers are our heroes." Let me repeat that. Teachers are our heroes. This is true. By way of example, the last 24 months have again made this statement so evident, with teachers rotating, twisting, and turning to provide opportunities for students to learn, to relate to students at their level and where they are, to help them become happy and fulfilled persons. Research conducted with students about heroes found that the students described local heroes as speakers who would be able to tell positive stories about altruistic and courageous behavior that could bring about a modeling effect of some kind. Indeed, the list of qualities or definitions of a hero generated by research participants include someone to look up to as a role model, someone who devotes his or her life to others or to a cause, or one who helps those in trouble. Ultimately, according to the students, heroes are honored for their goals, achievements, attitudes, and actions. They stand out from the rest of us for doing something special or extraordinary. That certainly describes teachers today. Given the return to classes this January, teachers are again being tested with possible remote learning provisions, sending home a class or a year group, preparing learning packs, emergency closures, the absence of colleagues, teachers' own absence, and the isolation associated with it. Yes, teachers are our heroes. These heroes are being challenged and draw on their values, their knowledge, and their past experiences when making decisions. Almost everything a teacher does carries weight. Every response to a question, every assignment handed out, every discussion on issues, every resolution of a dispute, every grade given to a student carries with it the moral character of the teacher. And every day, teachers individually are faced with ethical choices. Teaching is a profession, and teachers have immediate and indelible influence on the ethical lessons that children learn directly and indirectly. Truscott and Crook's work on ethics and teaching begins with, perhaps more than in any other profession, ethics are essential to teaching. An ethical teacher is an ethical person who demonstrates the principles of non-malfeasance, or do no harm, beneficence, or do good for the students, just, or being fair and equitable in dealing with students, autonomy, or allows students personal freedom over thought, and truthfulness, or promote integrity. A recent Canadian study reviewed codes of ethics and pinpointed 6 core values of teacher professionalism. These are care, solidarity, pedagogical excellence, liberal democracy, integrity, and reliability. A professional is expected to respect these core values of their profession and professional practice. These principles are only one part of ethics or a code of ethics, and as the collective conscience of a profession, they're limited. A code of ethics is the result of a collaborative process, with many people involved in discussion and development, aimed at providing the ethical base of professional practice that is meaningful to teachers. This requires teachers to be involved in that collaboration in the development of the code. In your case, the institution mandated to produce the code is the General Teaching Council for Scotland. In my case, it's the Ontario College of Teachers. And as an aside, the privilege of professionalism has been granted to teachers working in specific jurisdictions. It is through the General Teaching Council for Scotland, currently one of the only independent registration and licensing agencies in the world, that Scottish teachers have this privilege. Further, teachers cannot merely be content to know the regulatory aspects that guide their practice and then just technically apply them. They must act professionally, which means basing their actions on their professional judgment. Frankl stated that a profession's code of ethics is perhaps its most visible and explicit enunciation of its professional norms. A code embodies the collective conscience of a profession and is testimony to the group's recognition of its moral dimension. In looking at types of codes, many exist, but generally one of these three is found in the professions, as Frankl noted. One is aspirational, stating the ideals of the profession, emphasizing the values that guide it and the role of the profession in society, moving beyond merely the following of minimal collective norms of ethical professionalism. Second one is educational, providing practical guidance to members through a set of ethical standards that are shared. And the third, regulatory, providing detailed rules governing conduct. There are, however, alternative conceptions of ethical professionalism, examples of how professionals can negotiate the ethical demands and complexity of the professional life beyond the three that I've just cited. Ethics of care and caring. Care is a reciprocal act, a relationship between a giver and a receiver of care. For example, teachers and students. To give appropriate care, teachers must come to know their students well. It's a matter of looking for signs that the caring has been received, which will then complete the caring relationships. Ethics of hospitality. We are all stewards of this world, given the responsibility to look after it. Teachers are strategically positioned in this transition. As teachers, we are unlocking the world for the newcomers to the world, our students. We are already guests of this world, of our traditions, of having already been welcomed into the world ourselves. Rutenberg identifies the teacher as the one who must enact and model hospitality and to welcome students into a particular world of knowledge. Ethics of teaching. Chris Higgins states that the ethics of teaching must be that domain of inquiry concerned with and why the activity of teaching is worthwhile to the teacher. One of the reasons teachers might choose to enjoin themselves in the practice of teaching is precisely to participate in an ongoing conversation, that's at least 2,000 years old, about how we know and what is worth knowing, about how we grow and what is worth becoming. And students are fortunate whenever they have teachers who lead such an examined life. These last three ideals go well beyond the nature of duty and obligation and explore the complex ways of seeing, feeling, and responding to others that give life to teacher professionalism and inform the serious work of developing a professional ethics of teaching. We expect teachers to exemplify professional ethics when they teach and to conduct themselves with the profession's current values. Much of our time is spent often making ethical decisions, even without us realizing that we're doing so. Time and again, we need to analyze a situation using our knowledge and judgment to make educative decisions supporting students, as an example, and be accountable for our decisions based on fundamental values and standards of the profession, all of which have an impact on the lives of others. This form of analysis, this ethical reasoning skill, is associated with better teaching in the form of being more empathetic towards students, tolerant of diverse viewpoints, teaching more responsively, motivating students' learning, and promoting students' social development. Reasoning ethically is also related to teachers seeing their role as more facilitative than directive, using rules to protect student rights, collaborating with students concerning their needs and interests, and advancing student understanding and responsibility. A deliberate reasoning process will help when we're challenged with new situations to meet the ethical expectations we face. The more often we encounter new situations and repeat the process, our personal ethical values become increasingly congruent with our professional ethical values. Through an ethical reasoning process, a deliberate reflection on experience, a type of self-research, making ethical decisions that are justifiable and professionally appropriate will become more intuitive for us. Truscott and Rourke suggest listen, feel, think, and act as a process of ethical deliberation. Now, this model may sound simplistic. However, it provides the questions we ask ourselves and the ideas that we need to process to make certain we're making ethical decisions. When deliberately and critically reflecting on our actual actions and not what we think we do, we deduce the otherwise inaccessible nature of our ethical intuitions and intentions. As we listen, we take the needed time to understand the social conditions of our decisions and actions without rushing into a decision based on limited information. When we ask questions and listen to others with respect and compassion, and with whom we have relationships, we can better appreciate the interpersonal context of the problem we face. Careful listening brings us to consider how we feel about the circumstances, encouraging us to look inward and honestly taking stock of our true intentions. We almost always have strong feelings about an ethical dilemma. That's how we usually become aware that something needs addressing. Instead of ignoring it, we can treat it as guides to our motives. By intentionally incorporating our emotions into our ethical reasoning, we harness their power to motivate us toward the right action and doing the right thing that may be difficult. Knowing that something is the right thing to do doesn't mean we'll be able to see it through to its completion. Up until now, we've looked at the interpersonal circumstance, our relationships, we've listened. Our personal intentions, we've examined how we feel. Our next step requires we think about any relevant professional, ethical, duty, guideline, or legal standard that may exist, and review these documents, standards, codes, and guidelines, and even an occasional legal case. In examining these documents, we're able to shift our personal ethics so that we can feel differently about what we prefer to do. When we compare and contrast our personal beliefs with what's expected of us, we can identify any dissimilarities. With this information, we're able to consider our intentions in a new light. In the act stage, with all things being equal, we're expected to choose the alternative that is least likely to cause harm and do the most benefit, in that order. Least likely to cause harm, do the most benefit. Having identified the best course of action, we're then expected to carry it out. If, though, while we're at this step, we find some new circumstances that could have consequences, we need to deal with those, which brings us back to the listen stage. This explains why our model is a circular, iterative form. This process of reflective ethical reasoning, of self-research, provides a framework for considering how our ethical intuitions align with the ethical expectations of teachers. The language of principles and rules can sometimes feel abstract and devoid of inspirational values and virtues. In practice, however, it can serve as a helpful guide for applying ethical concepts and expectations to the problems of deciding how to act in specific situations, especially in those situations where the stakes are high. This process of self-research, or reflective reasoning, also helps with the development of professional competence, which I'll look at shortly. This process goes beyond how we see the standards or duties of teachers and looks at the issue of teaching as a moral profession and further develops our ethical selves. While the code embodies the collective conscience of a profession, it also ties into our teaching to help inform it. Maxwell suggests recognizing that ethics education is part of the core work of professional formation and development, rather than a frill, and working towards a more cohesive discussion about what matters most in teaching and learning about the ethical dimensions of teaching will bring the dialogue to the forefront. These conversations will inform our work with students and help to develop our ethical selves. Ethics has its roots in the perpetual practical question we ask: what should I do next? And in our more contemplative moments, it matures into questions such as, what do I want to become? What does it mean to be fully human? And what would make my life meaningful, excellent, or rich? The ethics of teaching, then, must involve questions about what constitutes human thriving and how helping others grow nourishes the teacher's own growth. Because the enterprise of education is a deeply ethical project intended to help students flourish, it's easy to forget that the practice of teaching itself is a project for the teacher, part of the teacher's quest to lead a good life. This is how I thrive. This is how I develop my ethical self. To think deeply and critically about being a teacher. What supports do I need as a teacher to thrive? To develop my strength-oriented perspective and present my narrative in my voice. I develop resilience. I connect with colleagues who ally with me. I need time and space to develop this professionalism. Many voices weigh into the professionalism of teachers. Henry Giroux's concept of the teacher as a transformatory intellectual challenges the traditional idea of teachers as technicians. Giroux doesn't accept the idea that teachers are merely performers, professionally equipped to realize effectively any goals that may be set for them. Rather, they should be viewed as people with a special dedication to the values of the intellect and enhancement of the critical powers of the young. He continues, it's important to stress that teachers must take active responsibility for raising serious questions about what they teach, how they are to teach, and what their larger goals are that they're striving for. This means that they take a responsible role in shaping the purpose and conditions of schooling. Recognizing teachers as engaged and public intellectuals means that educators should never be reduced to technicians, just as education should never be reduced to training. We educate, we don't train. Much of what I've talked about today also has to do with professional competence, which Trescott and Crook explain is the cornerstone of professional practice. Professional practice comes through specialized knowledge, intensive preparation, a code of conduct, an emphasis on continued learning, and public service. Society expects, in our case, that teachers perform ably the critical tasks that define our profession. 4 essential components for professional practice, for professional competence, are knowledge, skill, judgment, and diligence. The knowledge base for teaching is constantly evolving, which requires continuing study on our part to remain current. With skill, we apply the knowledge effectively as we progress from basic teaching to a proficiency for specific teaching procedures. This non-static component necessitates that we stay current in the field. The application of knowledge and skills requires judgment, often acquired through much practice and through self-research or reflection. This continued growth is due in part to our diligence, but it's hard work. Professional competence requires that we teach to the best of our ability with each student. What more do we know? The volatility and uncertainty, the complexity and the ambiguity that teachers have had to live with these past few months will likely continue for the next while. Complex adaptive systems, even in the best of times, are dynamic, with many moving parts, and are forever teetering between a sense of equilibrium and disequilibrium. Although it can be overwhelming to try to engage in meaningful teaching and learning, there are already hopeful signs and potential benefits. We have been and are being forced to move to be more adaptable, more flexible, and more creative than we have probably ever been expected to be. This, according to Hasanoff and Manzuk, is a sign that we are all living on the edge of chaos, the sweet spot for creativity and innovation. So, while there is definitely cause for concern at this uncertain time in history, we should also take heart that as members of complex adaptive systems, we are also reaping benefits that we may not even realize for years to come. At the risk of repeating myself, teaching is complex work, both relationally and intellectually. Developing teaching professionalism is about the way we are as professionals. We connect and reconnect with values. We claim or reclaim the voice that may have been silenced or has been silenced. We share and reshare our understanding of ethics, values, voices that permit shaping and reshaping the policy discussion and advocating the needed policies. Thank you. Tapalif, miigwech.